David Naimon is, in brief, a writer and host of the radio show and podcast Between the Covers. As noted by his production partner, Tin House, these long-form, in-depth conversations have been singled out by The Guardian, Book Riot, The Financial Times, and BuzzFeed as one of the most notable book podcasts for writers and readers around. End quote. Born out of his interviews with the singular author, Ursula K. Le Guin, he is also the co-author of Ursula K. Le Guin, Conversations on Writing, published by Tin House Books in 2018. In a beautiful posthumous exploration of Le Guin's influence as a person and as a writer, and with the blessings of her son Theo, he has also started a new series of episodes on the podcast called Crafting with Ursula. David's writing has been published in Tin House, Catapult, Orion Magazine, and elsewhere, and reprinted in anthologies including The Best Small Fictions, The Best American Essays, The Best American Travel Writing, and the Pushcart Prize Anthology. Now, David, if I could have you close your eyes briefly. Keep them closed until I let you know. For those of us here in person, or let us know in the chat, can I see raised hands? Who's listened to Between the Covers before? Eyes closed.
I really have to keep them closed?
Okay, hands down. All right, it's a mix. It's a mix. You can open your eyes. And I know there will be more of you after hearing from David this morning. But for those of you who have listened to the podcast, you already know that he does nothing in brief. In fact, the extraordinary gift he offers to both listeners and guests on the podcast is the time and the focus that he dedicates to each episode. And I don't think I'm the only one who recognizes how uncommon that is at present, to really find that depth. And it makes it all the more rewarding to listen to. The podcast is about literature. He interviews authors, fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. But in truth, it's more than that, a blend of literary exploration and critique, philosophy, creative process, the genesis of ideas, and deep dives into esoteric realms, all bundled into charismatic conversations with interesting minds. So today we get to reverse things and let David have the chance to be the interviewee. David, I'd love to begin by asking you just about how the podcast came into being. It's not something that you've done forever. You've done other things, but you've developed a form that just seems so well suited to how you explore and talk to other people. And writing as well is something that you came to later in life. So for our audience, I'd love it if you could just kind of walk us up into how you became the David Naimon host of Between the Covers.
Thanks, Caitlin. So I was a naturopath acupuncturist for 22 years until about 6 months into the pandemic. And unlike a lot of the people I went to school with, I don't feel like I ever felt like being a healthcare practitioner described most of my interests or most of my personality. So when I left school, I felt like part of me had been lost through the 5 years of being in school. And so when I got out of school, I started doing all of these things that I hadn't been able to do for 5 years. I started volunteering as an engineer at a radio station. I got back involved in political activism. I started a book group to read Ulysses, which still exists now 20 years later, and we're going to read the Odyssey this year to sort of commemorate. And sort of rebuilt and built a community of friends and peers that mostly were not from school. And in the process of working at the radio station or volunteering at the radio station, they discovered that I was also a naturopath, and the person leaving the health show, they needed somebody to host the health show, and I said no. And then I had no interest in like stepping further into that beyond what I was already doing. But then I ended up saying yes. It was terrifying, but I enjoyed it for a while. Like I did it for, I don't know, 10 or 15 years. And the first part of the time I really enjoyed it. And then it started feeling very predictable because you could read a book by a doctor or say about rheumatoid arthritis or something, and then you knew what they were going to say, no matter how good the book was, before you had the conversation with them. So you'd show up, you might have loved the book, you ask the question, and they say the answer that's very similar to what they said in the book. And I realized that a lot of the only conversations that were really enduring were with people who were writing in health, who were also writing books that had interesting language, like if I would talk to Atul Gawande or Siddhartha Mukherjee or Michael Pollan, there was a sense of mystery in those conversations. The conversations felt alive and in the room. And so when someone left from the book show and they needed people to like start filling in for conversations, I was scared to have conversations at the time around art, but decided I'd try it because I was sort of losing my interest in what I was doing. And at the first person I ever talked to was Anthony Doerr, who is a really big writer now, like extremely big writer, but at the time he was not. He was a writer's writer and very loved for short stories. And I could say a lot of my movement towards that comes from my encounter with him, because he's such a nice person, but he was just, every question I'd ask, he would just be so, I don't think this is particular to me, but it felt like at the time, like I'd ask a question and he'd start his answer by like, oh my God, this is like the best question. And then like, so it was this really wonderful like way into this other thing that I step by step sort of generated its own momentum. But that's how it started as a first step.
It sounds like some no's, some hesitation, but you found your way into it. And then it hasn't lived as a podcast this whole time. And it hasn't been your full-time endeavor, obviously. That's more recent. We were talking about, you kind of taking the leap to doing this full-time. And now that you've done it, you wouldn't change it. You wouldn't take that back. But at the time, it was so scary, and you really hesitated. And I'd love you to walk us through kind of that moment happening at the intersection of the pandemic, of just what makes it feel like that. And then the other part of that is moving that to full-time also meant that you had to make a different ask of your audience to make it a listener-supported podcast. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on what part of that kind of came into the hesitation or the concerns, because you had to ask your audience for something that you'd never asked them before, or ask guests on the show to be involved in ways that they hadn't before.
Yeah.
Hold on. Can I please request, though, I don't get to do a lot of interviews, so I'd like the full Anthony Doerr treatment of, Caitlin, that was such a great question. Thank you so much. Even though it didn't really end in a question mark.
That was an amazing question, Caitlin. So like when I got out of school, I was, single. I didn't have a family. I felt like I'd sort of lost myself, and I set up my life. I hadn't really thought about it this way, the upsides of what I've left. But the upside of what I left was I set up my life so that I could do all these other things. And I had this half-time practice that would just barely cover like the expenses of living. And then I walked to work. I had this 20-minute commute, and I filled half of my time with doing these other things. And I did these really long patient interactions, like 90 minutes with nice gaps in between, so that when the day was over, I wasn't tired. So like there was a sense of like curated life balance that I had. But the last 5 years of that, my heart wasn't in it as much. And I think part of it was that during that other half of my life, I was doing all these other things, and part of that other thing was finally coming into like writing. I'm a person who tends to decenter myself and be a listener, and so it's hard to flip, like, and have Caitlin be interviewing me, but there's a certain privacy even in doing the radio or the podcast. You're just in a room with one other person. There's an intimacy, the audience is abstract. But as I moved into like self-expression, there were ways in which I felt like I was decentering myself that started to feel more limiting to me. So there was never really a sense of how I could make a leap from my practice to doing. So I had the podcast already. I had a modest income stream from the podcast, but nothing that I could ever make any sort of substantive decision around, nothing that could change what I was doing in my life. But because I was moving into the pandemic already with this like absurdly, half-time, low volume practice by intention, and then we have the pandemic on top of that, and then so it's less people coming in, and then we didn't know what the virus was, and I'm in this confined space, poorly ventilated space, and my heart wasn't entirely into it, and I was like, this isn't really making sense, and I've wanted to move towards doing this, but it was absolutely mortifying, the idea of like, I'm not a person who's into marketing. I'm not, all the choices that I've made around the show have not been with a sense of what could create the greatest appeal. So the idea of having to like make an ask of people who were listening to the show or past guests of the show, I thought I was gonna die. And, but there were people who were listeners, because there are people I talked to, some people who I'm friends with through the show who are listeners, but just other people occasionally reach out and we have correspondence. And one of them is somebody who had done some stuff professionally, like with their organization that they were involved in. They basically just held my hand. Most of the advice that they gave didn't really feel like true to me in terms of the language, but in terms of just having somebody be like, you can do this, you're not gonna die if you like ask. Because there's also the sense that I was gonna die when I started writing too. I feel like this sense of like, can I expose myself? Can I realizing that I can withstand criticism, I can grow from criticism, I can be seen and still continue. And so I guess there was a point where I decided I'm gonna make a leap and I'm gonna ask people to like catch me and see whether this happens. And I didn't know whether that would happen. And then at the same time, the radio station went on lockdown, and I had to figure out how to do everything remote, because before it was in person only, which I thought, and I falsely I realize now, I thought there was something magical that would happen if you're in the room with somebody that wouldn't happen if you're not in the room with them when you're having a conversation. So there was this sense of like, okay, being in the room together, their body language, sharing the space, something intangible is adding itself to the conversation. There's more chance for intimacy. I don't believe any of that anymore. But I'm a technophobe also, so like the idea of like, I didn't know anything about microphones. I didn't know software or audio editing equipment until the pandemic, and then I had to like figure out how I was on the spot to like set up some sort of makeshift situation, which is now my permanent situation in my guest room of my house, often disturbed by my cat.
It's an essential element of the creative workspace is the disruptive cat, actually.
Yes.
Doesn't happen without it. And so the podcast is now, you run everything through Patreon, and folks can become a listener supporter. You also you have some amazing blurbs and even videos from incredible authors who have been on the show and are telling people about how incredible it is, which I'm sure those were tough to ask for. It sounds like a lot of this was just uncomfortable and new, but you moved forward. You also put an ungodly amount of time into each episode. You would say you average probably 80 to 90 hours of preparation for each episode.
I mean, the irony is like I was working 20 hours a week before, and I now I now probably work 60 or 70 hours a week, but I like what I'm doing. It's not a good balance. It feels there's something unhealthy about it, but at the same time, like my heart is in it in a different way. Like, so it's different than the 20 hours before. But yeah, like lots of the aspects of the show, like I feel like we're just, what would I want to hear? Which sounds, I mean, on the one hand, that sounds like selfish, but on the other hand, it's like I wanted to go for, maybe there are other people who, if I really lean into what I would want to hear, also feel the same. And so less thinking about how could I appeal to the most people, but rather go for finding the people who would feel passionately about it this way, which will probably alienate other people, but sort of start from a place of doing something that's very particular and very much not about strategizing what that is, but following maybe the way I would want a situation to be in terms of what I would want to listen to with an author, which is different because like there's lots of shows that I love to listen to that are not like mine, and I also understand that some readers, they just want to hear about the author behind the book that they've read, but they don't want to necessarily get into like the nuts and bolts of how the book came into being. And I understand that. So there are readers who may not be the listeners for my show, but at the expense of that, like the show just has a preponderance of writers and art makers and aspiring writers and art makers as listeners, which I really love. And so there's like a trade-off, not one that I was like consciously debating, but I do feel like in a way the depth rather than the breadth is what's worked out for me.
Yeah, I did want to get into this question of, doing things that, as you said to me, don't seem like they should work on paper, and doing a podcast that's, 1 to 2 hours long, that takes all of this in-depth preparation, that has often you speaking as much as the guests, because your questions are very long and give a lot of context and give a lot of your insights and thoughts on the work. And you bring, a lot of yourself into the podcast that way. It's not the average podcast, and it's not what, if you started from a marketing team, they would say, this is what you should do. Or, if you get to interview Ursula K. Le Guin, this is how you should do it, or this is the topic you should talk about. I think your first interviews with her were about her poetry, which, how many in this audience even know that she wrote poetry? It's not really the primary focus, but it's interesting, and you did it because it was interesting to you. My theory is that what you're doing is, often creatives get on podcasts like this and they're asked, what's your creative practice? And the easiest way to answer that is with like, what's a routine? And routines are not really where your idea comes from. So what you do is, by talking about the work and your own ideas and the context, you create a space where the writers can re-experience their own work in a new way, or remember what it was like as they were creating that. And so then they can really tell you from an authentic place the genesis of the idea, and not from a like, well, I get up at 5 and I sit down at my desk with my cat at 5:30 every day. So anyway, that's my theory, and I'm curious to hear more about how you've continued to evolve the structure of the podcast, if anything has changed, and kind of what's your theory behind why it continues to work this way, and if you would have done anything differently, knowing what you know now, that you would be doing this kind of full time.
It's a great question.
Thanks, David.
It's true that, so like in the best conversations, it's like I'll ask a question for 3 minutes, which is a long time. And then the answer will be 8 minutes where the person talks and I'm not speaking, and then repeat essentially, but these long periods of time. But I feel like I don't ask, a lot of times guests, because the shows can be 2 or 3 hours long, but definitely at least an hour and a half. People are like, future guests are like, how are these people coming up with these answers? And they're nervous, some of them. And I don't share the questions and I don't ask them to prepare. And what I explain to them is that all of my preparation is to try to place myself in the universe of their animating questions that they've lived with their whole lives. So if I can like get myself to within that, all the things that constellate what makes their life important and their art making important, it does happen naturally. And they often comment afterwards how quickly the time goes by. So part of the questions is demonstrating on my end that I'm taking what they're doing seriously and that I'm coming to this with interest. So, I mean, there's that part. I mean, the part about like whether that's going to work for a listener, like I don't think any of it works on paper in that regard. Like who's going to listen to me talk to a poet for 3 hours or whoever, not specifically a poet, but people are. I mean, that's the miracle of the whole thing is because originally the podcast, when it was a broadcast, because of the broadcast aspect, was either 28 minutes or 56 minutes long. And then, but the nice thing with the podcast form is there's no form. And people can stop or people can jog to it or, I mean, I don't know if I'm answering your question around that, but.
Yeah, I'm curious. You also, I mean, when we were talking about this too, you seem surprised sometimes by where your own podcast takes you, and
For my own podcasting, what?
just where it takes you, or where it ends up. I was listening to some of the recent ones, and you're planning these out, the guests, months in advance. You're spending all this time researching their work, and yet you were still kind of surprised by all these connections between your interviews with Shayla Hetty and Karen Balin, and other kind of organic things that just. They come up as maybe part of your subconscious and your own creative questions. So, so there's part of it where you're taking advantage of the freshness of your guests not getting the questions in advance, which I was surprised to learn. It all sounds so thoughtfully prepared. But why do you think it surprises you sometimes? Where is that coming from?
I mean, it shouldn't surprise me, I guess, in that regard, because I'll go through these phases, like maybe I have a question or questions about certain things about writing for myself, and I want to gather other writers who may have better answers or be asking the question and answering them in contradictory ways. And so then you might see like a vein of episodes that might magically feel like they have these connections, and then I don't realize that I've invited them because of that. Or, for other reasons, like there could be any number of reasons why I'm interested in a certain aspect of art making or what's going on in the world, because a lot of these writers are also engaging with, things that are alive in contemporary politics or in anthropology or philosophy or, and then that will create a further question so I don't think that if I look at it objectively, but sometimes the connections in real time with the writer, it all of a sudden is producing a sense of surprise because of someone I had invited 3 episodes before, but probably had invited originally based on a similar impulse around something.
Just following that intuition. I'm curious too on that, like following your intuition. I was shocked to learn that you are often not reading them before you decide to interview them. And so what part of your intuition informs, or what criteria do you use to choose who you want to talk to?
Some of it's easy, like if someone who I've already read or already know about, so that's simple. But then, I'm balancing a whole bunch of things. So nonfiction, fiction, poetry, science fiction, fantasy, hybrid work. And so I'm thinking when I'm curating the roster for the year, how much it's leaning one way versus the other. But there's not a direct correspondence between whether a conversation is really good and whether a book's really good. There are people who write really amazing books who don't give great conversations, typically. And so sometimes I'll give an example, like this publisher in Canada, I reached out to them to get a copy of an older book by a writer I was going to interview. And they slipped in a copy of a new book of a different writer I'd never heard of. Her name's Doireann na Gríofa, and she's a poet in Ireland. And they were hoping I'd interview her, and I was full. But I looked at what the book was, how the book was formed, and it was really interesting to me because it's part memoir, but it's also an engagement with Irish keening, which is a form of poetry. It was often a lament for the dead by women who were denied literacy, and so they would compose these laments, and then they would pass them down one body to another through time. So it was this like memorized form. And often there are some very famous ones that have been published in Ireland, but often the lives of the women have been erased. And so when you go into the archives in Ireland, you only find out about their less remarkable husband or their brother. And you have to so she decided to do this book that was going to try to like revive the story of this woman who wrote the most famous keen in Ireland. She was going to translate it from the Irish to the English, which is in the book. So it's a meditation on translation. It's a memoir of her own life coming into early motherhood. And so it had all these elements, and I was just confident this is going to be a great conversation, even if I don't like the book. I loved the book, and I do because I'm so I have no discretionary reading time. I want to maximize how many of the people I have on are writing books that I want to be reading. So it's not like I don't care. I care very much, but there isn't a correspondence. Like sometimes I love somebody's book they wrote 3 books ago way more than the book we're talking about. But the goal is how can I create this really dynamic conversation with the writer, not how many great books will I read in that year. Nor is it a recommended reading list, even though everybody seems to presume that these are the 24 books that I would recommend everybody go out and read next.
Side by side, Obama's recommended books for the year, David's recommended books for the year. I did go buy a couple of authors you talked to. Now I'm nervous about their books. It's all right, I'll still read them. It's enough to make time for all of that, but you don't only just read other people's work, you write, which we haven't talked a lot about as another creative practice. And like many in our audience, I think you benefit from having kind of multiple tracks of interest, multiple veins of creativity that you're in that kind of support each other. But one is really the business now, and one truly is still a creative pursuit, or as Christopher would ask, a hobby. I don't know if you define it as a hobby. I'm sorry if that feels terribly rude to a writer.
It's not.
But let's talk about how you balance the two, especially since you made the switch in 2020. And, you told me that your own writing takes kind of the back seat to podcasting. So what feelings let that happen, or where does writing fit into your life in this universe?
Well, I don't have I want to say I don't have a good work ethic, but I have a good work ethic, but I don't have like a built-in structure for writing on a daily basis. So I'll go to residencies for 2 weeks or a month and focus on my own writing. Or for like 6 years, I was half-time in the Portland State MFA program, not to pursue the degree. I didn't want to teach. But I really loved, they had these generative seminars where you would like immerse yourself in the reading of a topic. So whatever it is, sentimentality or the apocalypse or syntax. And then you would be asked to write while immersing yourself. So you weren't workshopping in those classes. And most of what I've published have either come out of residencies or from somebody giving me homework. I'm not very good at giving myself homework, but it's been really hard. I feel like the podcast is still in a place where I am leaning into it becoming more sustainable, I guess. I mean, it is sustainable way beyond what I ever imagined, but I feel like when it gets to a better place where I could do less, I think I could do more of the writing, or at least that's how I'm talking about it to myself. But hopefully, I mean, I have enough right now for a collection. I just need to figure out what's in it and what's not in it and how to organize it. So I need that sort of mental bandwidth to be able to do that. And it's hard when, that's the thing around the pandemic, the mystery around being overwhelmed. I don't know how much of that's moving to the podcast. I think part of it is, and feeling beholden to the people who've sort of said, we want you to do this. But part of it is also, I used to walk somewhere else for work, and then I would stop at a cafe and do a different sort of work, and then I'd come home and I was in a different sphere. And now I don't have any of that like physical demarcations. I'm always feel like I'm working. I'm sure other people feel that. But I haven't been very good at defining like space in relationship to activities. And that's been at the expense of writing, I think also, is that sense of not having, a space in my brain for it, really, more than anything. But
yeah, that's really interesting. Especially the physical boundaries and just kind of this stretchy gooiness. I guess we're gonna go full sci-fi, as Doctor Who would say, the timey-wimey stuff of the last couple years has really been, it's hard to draw the line between like what's work and what's supporting your livelihood and what is creative, especially if you're working in a creative field like lots of folks here. I think it was Lauren Groff, it may have been someone else, who I heard in an interview saying they designate a separate room in their house for each story they're working on. And I was like, that sounds great. Can I come to your house to do that? Like, there's certainly not room in my house. So I'm sure you feel some of that too, that the physical space really matters. We're getting close to 9:45 here, so I want to move to audience questions soon, but you used the word beholden, and I would like to ask you more about that shifting of responsibility or feeling you had toward what you needed to deliver to an audience or what you owe the authors you're interviewing, and kind of specifically the context that you set up for each of those. I think you do a really great job of in curating your lineup, getting a diverse mix of authors and spaces that they're working in, but also in presenting them to your listeners. You do a lot of work to make sure that we understand and the authors don't have to re-explain themselves or their identities. And so that's less a question than just that's something you do really well, and I'd like everyone here to hear more about how you do that and why you do that and what it does for the podcast as part of that responsibility.
I'm not sure what it does for the podcast, but I think sometimes the reason questions are long is because of what you're talking about. And this is my personal theory, is that when you live in an empire, there's a way in which a certain sort of solipsism is what keeps it going. Like, I think about like, say the Roman Empire, and like, you're expanding the places in the world that are going to speak the language that you already speak, and the coin is going to have Caesar's stamp on it now, and like we export like what we already know of ourselves in the world, and so there's just so many ways about our own history or about the history of other places that I think most of us are really ignorant about. And I feel a sense of vertigo sometimes when I learn something new that I've never encountered. Like I interviewed a Canadian Haitian writer, Myriam Chancy, and she has a book set during the 2010 earthquake. And in preparing for that, I was just blown away, like about, I was using in that interview an op-ed by David Brooks, which is a really terrible op-ed about the culture in Haiti and why it's the culture in Haiti that Haiti doesn't succeed and the Dominican Republic succeeds or Puerto Rico succeeds. But like if you go and you look at what happened after one of the first successful slave revolution and one of the first republics in the Western Hemisphere, and how it was embargoed afterwards, and how never before or after in history France goes to Haiti and says, you're going to pay us for freeing yourselves, for the property that we've lost. And so for 100 years, it's like between 50 and 80% of their economy was paying this debt to France. And also we invaded them and we nationalized their banks, the United States. Thomas Jefferson was terrified of what happened in Haiti. And going through all that history, I was like, this is mind-blowing that this isn't like central to what we learn in like history class. But it's like, I don't want Myriam Chancy to have to spend all of this time like updating my audience and me around the backstory, which isn't her book, but is the atmosphere of her book. And so I sometimes will use the questions as ways to get people up to speed. Like they're informative questions as much as questions. So like the first 2 minutes of them will be like folding in information, and then the question, so that the person can talk about their book, and yet I'm sort of like incrementally getting like the people who are listening up to speed on what we're talking about. I don't know, it's a complicated dance, but I do want to be conscious of imagining how much these authors are probably going around and that's not happening. And they're having to retell like just basic history when they should be talking about how they're writing and why they're writing what they're writing. Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. It does a lot of work, and I think is something a lot of folks could learn from. So we appreciate you sharing more about that.